Moreover, the war novel's focus on the agency of ordinary people resists the distant portrayal of them as victims, even though humanitarian narratives are victim stories deployed to elicit an empathetic response. We might be reminded of Fassin once more, who tells us that humanitarianism addresses those who can generally be constituted as victims of an overwhelming fate. The effectiveness of humanitarian narratives is mired in controversy. Is the objective to lift the victim or to create the savior? I would like to suggest that the war novel in Africa brings this way of writing about war into a crisis. It can be read instead as a genre of protest that aims to mobilize a democratic ideal of a people's right to history, the making and claiming of historical narration. The novel must accommodate the individual and the collective, and amplify, even exaggerate, as in its naturalist tradition, its portrayal of humanity, as feeling bodies and thinking minds. Thus, we also need to understand the genre as an attempt to bridge what Mahmoud Mamdani has described as the bifurcated state inherited from colonialism, which created educated citizens in the cities where ideas of rights, democracy, and nationalism were introduced, and disenfranchised subjects in rural areas where customary law was codified by colonialism. Thus, the war novel seeks to advance the peasants' citizenship claims. This bid is made on behalf of the people as the author's political gesture towards a more inclusive and just society. The people's right to the novel, a people's claim to representation in the narrative of the nation as historical agents, is a preliminary step towards breaking down the bifurcation that Mamdani identifies. The nation's effort to embody the voice of the people, to enact the people's right to the novel, counteracts the distance that reinforces the permanence of the bifurcated state. Moreover, the historicity of this genre is entangled in its rights claims. In the text I study, we see that war fiction insists not only on the remembrance of the war itself, but often on an explanation of its causes. War novels do so, usually against the considerable pressure to forget the war for the sake of reconciliation, or alternatively against the grain of official histories of the war. Thus, war fictions function as critiques of the peace by seeking to revisit the grievances that brought about the war and evaluate how they have been redressed. War fiction's memory of the violence is highly contextual and contingent and articulates political demands that link the before and the after. Moreover, war fictions give the lie to theories of salutary revolutionary violence central to postcolonial theory, which posit peace, often admittedly unattained, as a tabula rasa from which citizens will spring. Frantz Fanon spoke of the necessarily violent nature of decolonization and of decolonization's invention of new human beings in a nation which at independence, quote, constitutes from the very first day the minimum demands of the colonized. Writing during the Algerian War, Fanon was positing a horizon to reach for, and by minimum he means the full attainment of the goal without compromise. True national sovereignty can only be achieved with a simultaneous cultural decolonization that can shape new political formations. That's Fanon. War fictions, by contrast, seek to disprove the notion that out of violence you can create a tabula rasa. They point instead to the troubling continuities that link the before and after, as well as the unfinished business of the war itself. A post-conflict situation is overburdened with memory, and making sense of it becomes the project of war fiction. Okay, I will turn now to the four motifs that I think organize the African war novel in particular. Okay, so four motifs that repeat across national literatures and languages heighten the impression that the war novel forms a distinct literary tradition in Africa. I have named these motifs as follows: the song of my country, the male warrior as war personified, the ordeal in the forest, and the eternal landscape. These motifs capture something about the meaning of war and the ways in which we seek to make sense of it. Through their repetition, they disrupt the novel's insistence on the literal and gesture towards allegory, suggesting momentarily how the literature's hyperrealism transposes its particularity onto a narrative of resistance and aspiration, the outside of war. The paradigmatic instance of the Song of My Country can be found in Assia Jabbar's early novel of the Algerian War, Les Enfants du Nouveau Monde. The significance of this motif is that it foregrounds the scene of torture as a battlefield, a place of a public agon, instead of pathos hidden out of view, where there are now multiple participants and witnesses. Thus, it endows torture with the theatricality of the humanitarian spectacle of suffering, while also opening up the possibility for an agonistic kind of solidarity with the victim. In Jabbar's novel, the prison is a building with porous walls, where the integrity of the torture chamber as a sealed-off space is compromised. The voice of the nation is discovered here. Sitting in her prison, Salima, a young teacher, hears the screams of a torture victim in an adjacent cell. She cannot see him, nor can she guess his identity. Her first reaction is to try to block out the sound. She covers her ears, this is a quotation, in a gesture recovered from childhood. She begins to pray for the first time. Her self-protective gesture reveals that she understands her subjection to the screams of a victim of torture to be part of the terror inflicted on her. Yet after a while, she changes her attitude and decides to listen carefully to the screams and not to block them out. Through this effort, she forms a profound identification with the cries of pain. Why run away from it? One should listen. She's seized by a wild exaltation. This is the song of my country. This is the song of the future. She whispers an upright silhouette in the center of the empty cell, quivering with zeal and joy. When the voice falls silent, she becomes anxious, and when it starts up again, she listens once more. Jerky, brief groans at first, which then swell anew into a single endless scream, immense, and Salima rides it with all her willpower because it seems to her that at the end it will open a door into the heavens. Blue landscapes she sees, instead of the cell's gray wall, the noontime sun that blinds you, or the evening sun that reconciles, faces of smiling cherubs, of children she recognizes, of Suzanne walking, of the man. Who is he, she wonders, shivering again, yet from the first moment on transported well beyond compassion. Salima listens not out of an imperative to bear witness to this man's suffering, but because of the expansive consciousness she gains through the experience. Salima was transported well beyond compassion, to a vision of Algeria as place, blue landscapes, sun that blinds you, and people, specifically the children of the future, her students, in whose name the struggle goes on. Powerless to intervene and change the course of the torture, she seeks to learn from the sounds of torture, to intuit from them a vision, a conviction about the nation. In the novelistic account of torture in war, the victim's body becomes the site of war. In the near absence of scenes from the battlefield in this literature, torture is often the surrogate site of war. Synecdochically, therefore, torture is a moment where the fate of the individual victim becomes identified most closely with the collective story of the nation. In fictional form, the narrative of torture transforms individual suffering into a narrative of nation from the perspective of resistance to colonial state order. The male warrior as war personified finds its first prototype in Thomas Mofolo's Shaka. This most influential text, which was completed in 1910, revised in the early 1920s, published in Sesotho in 1925, and translated into English and French in 1931, stresses the transformational power of violence and its capacity to radically reinvent identity. Mofolo's great achievement is to have shown how war is human, war personified, and that we cannot disclaim it but must understand it historically. A mission-educated African, Mofolo wrote the novel at a time of important transition in South Africa's complex and multifaceted national emergence. 1910 marks the establishment of the Union of South Africa and the beginning of the segregation era that lasted until 1948, when the National Party was elected to power and imposed apartheid. Mofolo created an enduring, if often misread, portrait of a proto-nationalist African figure. Shaka encapsulates the destructiveness of war in which Africans and Europeans are complicit. At each turn, Mofolo depicts Shaka struggling with his conscience, yet choosing to follow the path of power and brutality. Not so much a moralizing religious portrayal of individual conscience, Mofolo's depiction of Shaka is rather an exploration of political choices that point repeatedly to the synergy between Shaka and the witch doctor Isanusi, who is an allegorical figure of colonialism, and thus the entangled histories of Africans and Europeans in South Africa.